Hi, everyone. It's Mr. Senti. Thank you for joining me today for this discussion that we're going to have regarding the midbrain and the diencephalon. That's right. The diencephalon is considered to be the interbrain. It's located right here in the inside of the brain. And the midbrain is considered to be part of the brainstem, but it's going to be emphasizing this upper part or superior part of the brainstem. And we'll start off with that. First thing I want to say about that is that this brainstem connects all the parts of the nervous system together as it may appear. It connects nerve impulses travel down and up the spinal cord. It even connects, there's nerves that are transverse into this posterior region of the brain known as the cerebellum. And then there's nerve tracts that go all the way up into the cerebral cortex. And there's all kinds of cool stuff that's happening in the midbrain. And then we'll move on to our discussion, the diencephalon or inner brain, and we'll talk a little bit about the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And I hopefully that will be cool as well. So one of the things I want to say about the midbrain is that I mentioned that it's considered to be, well, I didn't say this before, but mesencephalon or middle brain, and then we have the diencephalon or the inner brain. So to start off our conversation about the midbrain, located right here, I mentioned before, the upper part or superior part of the brainstem. It's located on top of the pons and also on top of the medulla, right up here. Okay, so the midbrain, that's its location. And so it's associated with, in terms of function, that's anatomy. In terms of function, it's associated with vision, hearing, and more to come about these things, motor control, and sleep, awake, arousal, sort of alertness, and temperature regulation. So it's sort of multifunctional, if you will. I found this picture to be particularly cool right here of the brainstem. Here's your medulla oblongata here, here's your pons, and then there's the midbrain. So one of the things about the midbrain, just to give you some orientation, we have sort of this interior view toward the front, and then we have this posterior area. But I'd also like to cut or transverse across the midbrain and look at some sections to further understand. And so this is our first transverse cut across. And so this is interior up here, and this is posterior back here. And so the midbrain can be described as being containing these big feet or cerebral peduncles, if you will, these feet. And there's going to be tracts of nerves inside here. We'll talk about that. And then this upper flat region right here is tegmentum. There's tegmentum right in here. And then there's the canal located right here. And this is posterior right here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these cerebral peduncles, if you will. So they contain tracts of nerves that link the cerebellum, the cerebrum, if you will, and cerebellum, and brainstem, and spinal cord. And so I was mentioning that before, that these nerves travel, motor neurons traveling downward, sensory neurons traveling upward. It's sort of a connecting system, allowing for nerves to travel to all sorts of the brain, and that's where they're traveling inside the tracts of the cerebral peduncles. You can see them here. You can see here there's sort of like the 2 feet right here, located there in there, cerebral peduncles of the midbrain. And so this tegmentum is an interesting aspect of the midbrain, but I think it requires a little orientation, if you don't mind. So this frontal view right here of the body, this is where we're talking about. Here's the midbrain, and here's the spinal cord coming down. Now, if you look at this frontal view and cut of the brain, and then you'd made another section across right in here of the midbrain, you'll see that this is what we're talking about. This flattened area is this tegmentum right in here. This is posterior back here. This is anterior toward the front. And so I want to look at some of this internal structure of the tegmentum. So here's a nice shot of a sheep brain looking at the tegmentum right here. It's basically without getting into detail, an area of gray matter. And gray matter, if you're familiar or not familiar with it, it's just an area in the neural tissue that has a lot of soma. In other words, it has a darker color because of the fact that there's a lot of nuclei in the area and a lot of ribosomes in the area. Okay, and it's on both sides, if you will, of the cerebral aqueduct, which is what this is right in here. And then inside the cerebral aqueduct, there's CSF fluid, cerebral spinal fluid. Okay. Another look at the tegmentum. This is sort of a computer-generated image of it right here. Here's the anterior, here's posterior right here. And I just want to point out the cerebral aqueduct also connects the third and fourth ventricles together in the brain. And so this is what we're looking at too. Again, here's the midbrain shown in green, and we're cutting it right here. This is a posterior view, if you will. And so this is anterior towards the front, posterior back here. And tegmentum is this gray matter right in here. Okay. And I will talk a little bit about this region right in here, this most posterior part right here, which is in between the cerebral aqueduct and in the posterior area right in here, known as the tectum or roof, if you will. I'll come back to that though. And so let's take another perspective, because I think, at least for my purposes, it's difficult to get orientated to the situation. I mean, it's just coming at you. And so I wanted to provide as many different sections as I could, sort of trying to be helpful. And so this is a mid-sagittal cut of a sheep brain. And so you're looking, here's the spinal cord, here's the cerebellum right in here. And so what we're looking at right in this region right here is the cerebral aqueduct. It's right in here, and then here's it highlighted here in purple. So that's where we are in the brain. This is the midbrain, obviously, right there. Okay. Now, inside this tegmentum, we have, do you notice here there's sort of this darker region right in here, but it's not too dark, but it's kind of a reddish color. And that reddish color has to do with there's just a predominant number of blood vessels in the area. And then do you notice here there's this area that's really dark right in here, substantia nigra. In other words, pigmented gray matter. Do you notice that area right in here? Substantia nigra. And so what that means is literally black matter as opposed to gray matter. Okay, so if this is gray, this is going to be considered black. And it should be noted functionally, dopamine is produced in this particular area, right, in that area. And the significance of it being darker has to do with the fact that those particular cells can actually produce the pigment melanin. How about that? It's the only part of the brain that produces pigment melanin, and you can see it right here. Again, this is posterior, this is anterior right here. This is the tegmentum. Here's the substantia nigra right here. And I should also point out that Parkinson's disease, a neurological issue, dysfunction, is characterized by a loss of that neuronal activity by the substantia nigra right in here. So the red nuclei I was mentioned before, look, this image, you could really see how darkened red this particular area is. And then on this image right in here, I'm highlighting it right here, and right here is the red nuclei. There's many blood vessels in that area. Here's the optic chiasma right in here, these optic nerves here. This is anterior in this direction. This is posterior over in this direction. Okay, so in this particular area, the red nucleus, it controls subconscious motor commands that affect the upper limbs and muscle tone in that particular area of gray matter. Okay, close up of the substantia nigra right in here and here, again producing melanin. I'm sorry, I'm stuck for words on that. Here's your red nuclei right in here. Here's the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, and so I want to segue right into this area right in here, this tectum right in here, or roof, in the posterior area right in here. So this tectum right here is made up of this really cool area. Do you see how there's 4 bumps right there? This is, again, posterior. And this would be surrounded by the cerebellum, right in this area right here. This is known as the corpora uh, quadrigemina. So, in other words, the quadruplet bodies. There's four bodies right in here, and so they happen to be sensory in terms of their functionalities, or just simply known as sensory nuclei. And there's some superior and inferior bodies, if you will. So just giving you a little back away just for a second here. So we're in the midbrain, and we're looking here. This is posterior. This is anterior right in here. Uh, Here's the tectum on this part right here in the quadrigemini, or right here. Here's your peduncles that are shown here in green. Here's your quadrigemini right there. And so these particular quadrigemini are referred to as the superior colliculus. So these superior colliculi, if you will, colliculus, singular, are for uh, visual, and inferior are for auditory, which is hearing. And so they're specialized into visual and hearing in this particular area of the midbrain. This is posterior look. Here's your peduncles over here on the side. Okay. Now you could really see the quadrigemini when you're looking at the transverse fissure of the brain, and you sort of pull down on the cerebellum. You could see these 1, 2, 3, 4 right here. They're two pairs of sensory nuclei, as I was mentioning before. And the inferior have to do with hearing or auditory, and each one receives auditory inputs from the medulla and pons, and so they relay those sensory inputs to the cortex, and so that's in this cerebrum, and they're responsible for reflexes having to do with loud sounds, and so sort of being startled by a loud sound. I find that to be kind of interesting. So these are the inferior colliculi right in here, having to do with hearing, inferior. And then the superior, in other words, towards the top there, highlighted in purple, they control reflexes having to do with, like, for example, bright light, and causing your eyes to respond to that. So they're visual areas. Nice shot here of the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. You'll notice that, or spoiler alert, that the thalamus, which is part of the diencephalon, is going to be located superior to this particular area. This is a posterior view. These are your cerebral peduncles right in here, carrying tracts right in here. You can see. All right. Nice view of the fourth ventricle right there. All right. And so I wanted to point out, I mentioned here the colliculi, and I was talking a little bit about the cerebral peduncles, which carry tracts. You're welcome to pause this and take a look at the functions more closely. But I want to also point out right in here, there's this reticular formation. I didn't mention that before, and those play an important role. Nerves, obviously, reticular formation, they play an important role in autonomic functioning. So that's subconscious. In other words, circulation, respiration, digestion, these sorts of things. And they also send nerves up for higher functions as well to the cortex, cerebral cortex. So those are significant. Okay, and so just to give you back in the way, this is where what we're talking about right here. This is the midbrain, mid-sagittal view of a sheep brain in particular. And then again, while we're looking at the mid-sagittal view, you can notice here's the the superior colliculi, which again are having to do with visual, right where it's pointing. The peduncles, you can see, mentioned these before. We were just talking about it, but here's what they look like mid-sagittal cut. They're right here in purple, and they're known as the little feet, as I was saying before, and they connect the midbrain to the forebrain, which is up here. Okay? And then again, if it's not clear enough, sorry for redundance, but hopefully clarity comes from this. Posterior view. Here is your quadra or corpora quadrigemini. In other words, your four little protrusions right here. You'll notice here's the superior and here's the inferior right here. Here's your peduncles right in here and here. There's your thalamus on top of it right here, pineal gland. This is coming in the video. Okay, and again, this is the location of where we are in the brain stem. So below that would be the pons, and then medulla, and then spinal cord. And this is posterior back here, anterior up in the front. Okay, so let's move on to the interior brain, or diencephalon. We're leaving the mesencephalon and going to the diencephalon. And so, as the name implies, it's in the middle, the inner brain. So pretty cool. So the diencephalon, or inner brain, is sort of, if you will, it's considered part of the back part, if you will. It's internal, but it's also sort of the caudal or posterior part of the forebrain. You consider this the forebrain, all right? And it does contain the thalamus and the epithalamus and the hypothalamus. Epi means upon or on top of, and hypo means below. So it's going to be below the thalamus. Hypothalamus is not pictured in this photo right there. And so what the thalamus does is it integrates and it routes information. And what does it do? It integrates sensory information and motor commands. And so it's kind of a router. It's disseminating, if you will. It's passing out information to that it's receiving from below and from the spinal cord, and it's disseminating that information. And I'm not sure if that's clear at the moment, but I'll try to clarify it. But it's going to be basically sending information to different parts of the cerebral cortex. I find this to be pretty important, if you will. So so just to mention, if a doctor were to diagnose or identify a patient with disease or sickness, it would be similar to a diagnostic. You know how if a doctor were to, diagnose or identify a patient's disease or sickness, that's kind of what the thalamus is doing. It's sort of diagnosing what the situation is in terms of sensory information. And then it sort of then sends that information to the cortex, and the cortex has to sort of contend with it. It's separated into a left and a right hemisphere, if you will. So there's a left thalamus and a right thalamus. You can see here in orange. All right. It's located, again, here's a nice mid-sagittal cut of the brain. It's located prominently right there, the thalamus. Okay, and so I was mentioning this before, but it's involved in a number of critical functions. Not only diagnosing a situation like a doctor would, but it's also a router. It routes sensory and motor neurons to the cerebral cortex, except everything but smell. Smell is not being routed there. And it also regulates consciousness, sleep, and alertness. And so I put a picture of a router right here, sort of helping you to remember that that's one of its main functions, that it relays sensory information. And it diagnoses it. Here's another picture of the location of the thalamus here, and it transmits that up to the cortex. Includes auditory information, again, tactile or touch information, and taste, but not smell. So again, a nice view of the thalamus here, the two lobes, and the information is then being directed to the cortex. It's the part of the brain, though, that's damaged. If it were to be damaged, all the sensory information would not be processed, and confusion would result following an injury to your thalamus. Okay, I should point out that what separates the left and right thalamus is the third ventricle, which is located right here. You can see the thalamus is highlighted here in blue. It's a nice view, pulling the cerebellum away, so you could see that a little bit. And then the lobes themselves of the thalamus are connected here by this interthalamic adhesion, if you will. So it's a projection of gray matter that extends from ventricle into the ventricle from each side, which connects the two lobes of the thalamus. Now, you may have noticed I was emphasizing the interthalamic adhesion, but notice all of these particular regions of the thalamus right in here. So this is kind of cool. Check this out. This is referred to as these masses inside. There's specialization that happens inside the thalamus. So they're thalamic nuclei. And so you can see here that there are different locations. And what's interesting about this of note is that these different locations, this is really interesting, that they are able to send up information here to the limbic system, the frontal lobes, the parietal lobes right in here. And so all of this information, this area right in here is going to the cerebellum. So this has been mapped, if you will. Do you notice how the color is located here? So there's a connection between where it's traveling up here in the cerebral cortex. So this is a lateral view of the brain, and the color coded is to indicate the regions that receive input from these particular locations inside the thalamus. And then if you're interested in the detail of this, again, feel free to pause this. This is in those particular nuclei, in those particular regions of the thalamus. That's what's happening. That's where the information is being projected into the cortex. Pretty cool. So talk a little bit about the epithalamus. Okay, so the epithalamus I mentioned before is upon the thalamus, and it functions as a connection between the limbic system to other parts of the brain. And some of its functions include the secretion of melatonin, if you're familiar with that. Melatonin is technically being produced by the pineal gland, and it's involved in circadian rhythm. In other words, around a day rhythms having to do with regulating sleep, and for one thing, and it also helps to regulate the pineal gland helps to regulate motor pathways and emotions. So pretty important, melatonin coming from the pineal gland. And again, it's found in the posterior part of your epithalamus. So again, upon the thalamus. So here's a highlight right there in blue of your pineal gland. So pineal gland, the name itself is it looks a little bit like a pine cone, a female pine cone. I think that's the reason for the name, pineal gland, and it secretes the hormone melatonin. Okay. Hypothalamus. So, this is the last structure that we're going to talk about in the video, but it's extremely, extremely important, the hypothalamus. It has so many important functions, and it's located right here below the thalamus. Again, the name implies that, hypothalamus. And it's responsible for motivational sorts of behaviors, having to do with feeling hungry, feeling thirsty, but that's not even all of it. And so it helps to maintain constant body temperature. And as you can see here in this picture, where are we here? The hypothalamus located right in here. Yeah, that's one of its functions. And it needs to be mentioned, and so I shall, that it also controls the pituitary gland, which is sitting inferior to the hypothalamus. And so it secretes hormones that both inhibit and stimulate the pituitary gland, which then in turn produces a potpourri of hormones which control many different functionalities in the body. And so the hypothalamus is really important. And so it controls the pituitary gland, which is the master gland that controls all these other endocrine gland functions and hormones. And so it plays a very important role in connecting the endocrine system. This video isn't about the endocrine system, though it should be pointed out I have some videos on the endocrine system. If you're interested, you can search for those. It connects the endocrine system with the nervous system. And truth be told, some of those neurosecretory cells that extend from the hypothalamus go down into the posterior lobe, which is right over here where I'm pointing, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which are important. Now, when I say extend downward, what I want to say is there's a stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Do you notice how there's two lobes of the pituitary gland right here, anterior and posterior? So anterior toward the front, which is here, posterior toward the back of the brain. And so that stalk is called the infundibulum, the stalk right in here that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And there's neurosecretory cells. In other words, hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, and they travel down into the posterior lobe, and then they're secreted that way in the posterior lobe. And so those two hormones are important. I'll mention them later: oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. But there's also some mammillary bodies, and again, they're located right here, which are right below the hypothalamus. So mammillary bodies that are, I guess, reminded early anatomists of breasts, maybe, process olfactory. So we were waiting for that. Like, where is the sense of smell information being processed? Right over there. And it also controls reflexes regarding eating movements. So mammillary bodies. Now, this particular area right in here is sort of a connection area. It's located between the infundibulum and the mammary bodies. In other words, the stalk that connects to the pituitary gland, which is right over there. And it helps to control the pituitary gland function. That is the tubercle area. As you can see, better picture right here. It's close up right there. Tubercle area. Here's the mammillary bodies right in here. Mammillary bodies. Here's the hypothalamus right there. There's the pineal gland right in there. There's your thalamus located right there. Pretty cool. Okay, and now finally, some of the 8 functions of the hypothalamus. And again, it provides subconscious control, skeletal muscle. It controls a variety of autonomic functions. It coordinates activities. I mean, it pretty much does almost everything. Nervous and endocrine systems. It secretes these hormones, antidiuretic hormone, which holds on to, reduces urine output, particularly of water. Oxytocin, which is an important hormone in labor, contractions of the uteral muscular wall. It also produces emotional, I mentioned this before, and behavioral sorts of drives having to do with hunger and thirst. It also helps to coordinate voluntary and autonomic functions. It regulates body temperature, and if that wasn't enough, it controls circadian rhythms. In other words, sleep cycles of day and night. And so, so much going on. I hope, again, as always, I like to point out the fact that, this is just the beginning of the conversation. And so hopefully this video, you found it interesting, informative in some ways, but the real purpose was to incite you to want to learn a little bit more or a lot more about your midbrain and the diencephalon, or your inner brain. It's pretty cool stuff. So good luck in your studies, and thanks for watching.